I got hooked on pornography in my teen years. I was a basketball fanatic and had a subscription to Sports Illustrated. And as it does once a year in the spring, the swimsuit edition came in the mail. And those images of the young 20-year-old women wearing not much more than a few straps of clothing, it lit a fire in me. And not long after that, I figured out what masturbation was. And from there, I wanted more. I wanted the next bigger experience. Having sex with yourself and looking at pictures, that only goes so far. So I ended up with graduating to sex with prostitutes. My first full sexual experience was with a prostitute. Promiscuity. I picked up an STD from a one-night stand at a bar. Probably the worst thing for me back in my early 20s was when I had a good friend of mine at work. He brought me home, had me into his house with his family. He was married and had 3 kids, and I ended up having an affair with his wife, broke up their family, and it was a real traumatic thing. And then so after that bottom, after just train wrecking my life with that big mess, I just knew I wanted out of it. So I stopped dating girls that were Christians and started going to church again. I'd walked away from church years ago, even though I'd been brought up in a Christian family. Stopped all the drugs and the alcohol. I'd been into that. And eventually met the woman I was going to marry, Michelle, and like most naive young men, I thought that as soon as I got married, it was going to fix my lust problem. So I married Michelle in February of 1989, and it was great. I thought I was done with pornography, but just months into the marriage, I started masturbating to porn again. Michelle was getting a lingerie magazine. She had no idea it was a problem for me, but as soon as those started coming in, it lit the fire all over again. And it's not that what she was doing was wrong particularly, it's just that I had this issue of lust that I brought into the marriage, and what I didn't realize was that you bring all of your false coping mechanisms, all of your sin habits, all the messes into your marriage, and if you hadn't resolved them, then it's just going to get worse, because the inevitable stress between 2 people from 2 different families brings out all the wrong ways of dealing with life. So I was back on the porn roller coaster again, but this time I just kept feeling emptier and emptier and emptier. I was more miserable than before. And a year and a half into our marriage, I went on a business trip. First several nights was binging on porn, and then I think it was the 3rd night, pornography suddenly just wasn't cutting it anymore. So I was in a hotel room, I took my ring off, made a phone call, and about 2 hours later I committed adultery with a prostitute. After she left, unlike the other times, I just felt completely filthy. And I couldn't believe what I'd just done. I was this Christian guy and going to church, doing all this stuff. Thought I had it all together. If you'd have told me when we got married that I would have committed adultery a year and a half into our marriage, I said no way. And I didn't understand that lust will always take you places you never thought you would go. So I told my wife several days later, and I'll never forget her response to the day I die, I think. The way she was crying and sobbing. This wasn't just crying from somebody who, you've said an insult, you've hurt them. This was deep sobs from the deepest place, the core of her heart, that showed me that I'd broken her heart. And I finally realized for the first time that I might lose my marriage. So I started looking for help. So I figured that the church should be a good place to start because, I mean, that's God's home and you read about grace and love. And so I figured that would be a safe place, or at least I hoped it was. And I went to a marriage conference with my wife, and the guy who was teaching that day was a retired pastor. And during the break, I mean, I was just dying in shame. I couldn't stand who I was. And of course, nobody was talking about porn, but I figured maybe if I talked to this guy one-on-one, you know, I might be safe. So during a break, I approached him and told him, hey, I got this problem. I'm struggling with porn. And immediately, I mean, when we were talking, he had this smile on his face, and then all of a sudden that smile went to anger. And then he just looked at me in fierce anger and said, just stop doing it, just stop. And I just put my head down, nodded, and just kind of walked away, and I knew that was the last thing I could do because I was in too deep. So from my way of thinking, that's it for looking for help in the church. So I went and found a phone book and found a 12-step group that was for people who struggle with sex addiction, and pictured all these sleazy looking scumbags when I go in there, and guys in t-shirts and, you know, trench coats and weirdos. And so I walk in there and they're all normal looking guys, and as everybody shares their story, I was shocked because I think 95% of them were Christians. One guy had been a senior pastor, one guy had been a music minister, and so it felt so good just to be able to come to a place and unload. Unfortunately, the first day, my first meeting, I told a big lie when they ask you how long you've been acting out, or when the last time was. I had acted out 3 hours ago. Well, I told them 3 days. I thought 3 days sounded better than 3 hours. I was too embarrassed to tell the truth. So that began, for me, a journey of 8 years looking for freedom. I got what that group called, by their sobriety definition, 1.5 years of sobriety where I didn't masturbate to porn. But then one night on a business trip, temptation got the best of me and I slipped. Then I went 3 years without it, thought I was doing good, but all along I was, as time went on, it really wasn't that firm, and then I lost it again. Only this time, I thought I was going to bounce back. I did not bounce back. I stumbled for the next 3 years straight, would binge on porn once a month, once every 3 months, once every 6 months, back to once a month. I could never get a grip on freedom. I was still going to the 12-step groups. And then one day I went on a business trip, November of '98. And I viewed porn for like 2 or 3 hours, but I didn't masturbate. Came back home, met one-on-one with this guy for lunch from the group. And the group's sobriety standard for sexual purity was no sex with self or others, but it didn't say anything about porn. So he said, well, hey, at least you didn't act out, meaning I was still sober by the group's sobriety definition, even though I had looked at pornography for hours. And then at that moment, a light went on that I was on the wrong path here. I wasn't going to get what I was after in this group with the way they were saying I needed to find it. And I started looking at God's word. In Matthew 5, he says, if you just look at a woman for lust, you've already committed adultery, you've already sinned. And that was like, that's it, gotta give up. I can't do this. I've done everything everybody said you're supposed to do, and I just made a mess out of it. And you're going to have to leave me, God. So at that point that I gave up, God just showed me a picture of my heart. And I thought all along, well, I'm this Christian guy, and, you know, they do ministry things every once in a while. I want to help people, and every once in a while, you know, I'd say the right Christian words and people, you know, say positive things. But in that moment, in that picture of my heart that God gave me, was pure black. There was absolutely nothing good in it. And at that point, I just broke and made him my only hope. not the group, not the sobriety definition, not anything else but the Lord himself. And first thing he led me to understand was that I had to go after this thing full bore, no compromise, no more playing with games, no more playing with lust thoughts in my head, no more screwing around with it. So I just started going all out, really for the first time in my life. I mean, even though I've been going for groups for years, there's a lot of guys that go to groups for years, and I was one of them. They go, they dump their sin, they feel better, and they go back and they're still in the mud. Well, even though the group told me I was powerless, God's word in Matthew 5 said, I'm the one that has the choice to cut off lust. So I started making those choices. And then a few months later, he started bringing all these verses about seeking God to my mind and in front of me, and I started seeking him for the first time in my life, all out. And then in a moment, one morning in June of '99, I was reading through 1 John and reading all these verses about God's grace and God's love. And I just said, God, why is it I read about your grace and I get depressed? And he spoke immediately into my spirit. He said, because you don't believe it. And then I realized at that moment that all my life, in spite of all the church, Bible knowledge, verses, theology, all that stuff, in the depths of my soul, I had not bought into the love of God for me. It was all head knowledge. I had been a head Christian, but my heart had been blocked off from grace because of all the lies I bought into. And then in that moment, there was like this burst of joy, and the truth just filled my heart with peace and love. And that's what gave me the power to say no to sin. And that's what set me free. So the books are for you. I was dying for clear answers when I was in bondage to that stuff. And there's a lot of confusion in the church. People get goofy when it comes to talking about sex. People don't want to talk about sex. So in the books, I just go after it. You'll see about a lot of very clear answers on what to do as far as everything from staying out of isolation to dealing with the masturbation problem, dealing with the core issues of the heart, and especially getting into everything inside of you, that the lies you might have bought into that are keeping you from experiencing the love of God. And it's not that I'm anything special, but it's been kind of amazing to see how God has used the books over the years. And I try to soak them with prayer before I sat down to write every time. One story, for the first book, I had to have it edited. And the lady who was the editor, I didn't know it, but it turned out she was married to a guy who was a porn addict. And she told me as she was editing the book that God was ministering to her through the pages of it. The second book, 100 Days on the Road to Grace, a devotional, was translated by a ministry in Germany, in Austria actually, and they had to translate it. And the lady who was a translator, as she was reading through it, one of the devotions, they told me later that God used it to do some healing in her life. So my approach is not from a very purely mechanical, like go to support groups and you'll be okay. It's not that simple. You've got to get into the core issues of your heart, and that's what this book is about. It's not just about the man either. It's also about, there's a lot in there for the wives and being accountable to your wife, telling your wife the truth, rebuilding your marriage. The devotional has both pieces in there. So my heart isn't just for the guy who's struggling, but it's also for the wife who is hurting. So I look forward to hearing from you, and please feel free to email me with any comments or questions.